Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Safety, Equity, and Transportation webinar. Kevin Chang of the University of Idaho will be presenting today on expert perspectives on school transportation safety. This work was funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation University Transportation Research Center projects. The award to establish the Center for Safety, Equity, and Transportation. And I will let Kevin take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Vicki. I want to thank the CSET for the opportunity to present on the work that we've done that focuses on school transportation safety. So I'm gonna go ahead and dive right in. So this is a presentation that supplements an earlier presentation that I had given, which had looked at specifically school transportation data. And I'm going to mention some of that data at the outset, but kind of gloss over it. If you're interested in the results from that earlier presentation, certainly you'll find the information available on the CSET website. So this presentation is entitled Expert Perspectives on School Transportation Safety. And as most of these presentations are, I will provide some initial background on this particular topic, go through the study methods that were used, spend the majority of the time talking about the results and the analysis, and then share a couple of concluding remarks, some lessons learned from this particular study. So in terms of background, a little bit about myself. I've been with the University of Idaho for about 10 years now, and prior to joining the faculty, worked with the King County Department of Transportation in Seattle, Washington, where I managed their school safety program, a program that involved working with over 16 school districts and 70 independent schools. And as any parent recognizes, the activity of providing some form of transportation to a son or daughter really dominates the schedule for a majority of the year. And so as you can see on the slide, within the United States, there are over 57 million students that attend either a public or private school throughout the country. And what that results in from a transportation standpoint is quite a lot of activity. A lot of times that activity is unpleasant. We refer to it as congestion, and it occurs predominantly during two very intense periods of time. Less so in the morning, when the arrival of the students tends to be a little bit more dispersed, but is still certainly prevalent. And then in a much more focused manner in the afternoon during the pickup period. And so that creates a lot of activity. We know that from a modality standpoint, there are many different ways that students can travel to school. Many of us in the industry would prefer that they focus on the non-motorized modes, certainly walking, bicycling predominantly. But for many students and their parents, that's not always possible. And so the other modes include, as you can see, the third bullet item by a car, and this can include the student if they're of age, being able to drive himself or herself to school, maybe riding in a carpool of some sort with a parent or guardian. Yellow school bus, of course, is very popular for students that live a distance away from the school. Certainly busing, transit bus, another maybe public transportation. And then there are a litany of other modes that seem to have popped up here in recent times. Certainly skateboard has been around, but now we've got scooters, e-scooters, e-bikes, et cetera, et cetera. And, one of the points that I always like to make is that, when we're focusing on the school trip, it's more than just identifying how students travel to school. We should also recognize that particularly if students get into a habit of walking or bicycling, that those behaviors can lead to a very fruitful, life later on when we start to encourage folks as adults to either walk or bike. And so what you have is, a situation where as the number of students who are walking and biking to school has declined over time, it's become a little bit harder when they become adults to get them to foster that type of behavior. And hence recognizing that that is an important element of the school transportation trip is highlighted here. So as I introduce the background to this study, I do want to highlight a report, a study that the Transportation Research Board did about 2 decades ago. And you can find it online. It's if you do a search of school transportation TRB special report 269, you'll be able to find a copy. And on this slide, I've summarized it at a very high level. What this study looked at, it was a school transportation study, and it focused on a review of available data, injuries, fatalities, exposure, so on and so forth, that were relevant factors that were relevant to school travel. It concluded that the risk management aspect of school travel is, not surprisingly, very complex, has many different variables that can influence safety, ranging from infrastructure and environmental factors to societal issues to, of course, the design and equipment of specific vehicles. And it also noted, and again, this was a report done in the early 2000s, that parents and students do prioritize factors such as the personal convenience, schedule flexibility, and of course, any financial costs associated with the school trip, oftentimes over maximizing their personal safety. And so as part of that study, as part of that report, we looked at a number of different aspects with regard to school transportation safety for this CSET project. And as I mentioned at the outset, one of the parts of this study looked at existing data that was available. And so you can see on the slide here, this is a screenshot of NHTSA's Fatality Analysis Reporting System, or FARS. And so what we did was we looked at the data that is available in FARS to see if we could identify some particular school transportation safety trends. Now, there is a caveat here, and again, I don't want to go into too much detail because the other webinar spent an hour talking about the process that was used. But essentially, when we're looking at school transportation travel and we're marrying it with the FARS data, we have to make some general assumptions. And what I mean by that is FARS, like any traffic crash database, isn't able to specifically identify all of the crashes and fatalities that are associated with a particular trip purpose, which in this case is school transportation. So we have to make some assumptions. Those assumptions can be not surprisingly time of day. So a school trip is typically going to occur either in the morning during that morning drop-off period, or it's going to occur during the afternoon pickup. Usually it's going to be on a weekday, although that's not always the case with in-service days and holidays sprinkled throughout the year. We also know that trips are going to predominantly occur between the months of September and June, although again, there's going to be a little bit of fluctuation from one community to another. Anyways, a lot of criteria were put in place for us to analyze potential crashes and fatalities associated with the FARS data. And I'm just going to very quickly show 2 slides based on our analysis. This first one shows the number of likely fatalities, likely school transportation fatalities that have occurred over the last 2 decades. 2 lines, the solid line, which is also shown in blue, represents fatalities in rural areas. And this is a designation that FARS has where it captures crashes that occur both in rural, along rural facilities and urban facilities. So the solid line in rural communities, facilities, and then the dashed orange line representing fatalities that have occurred in urban areas. And again, what we can see is, generally speaking, domestically, we have fatalities that range from anywhere from as high as 110 in the rural communities back in the early 2000s and 2008. And it seems to be ticking downward. The last data set in 2019 will note that the number of fatalities in rural, along rural facilities, just over 60. And the number of fatalities in urban areas has been along a pretty narrow band of between 40 and 80 fatalities each year. The other general trend that I wanted to highlight as a prelude to this particular study is the number of school buses that have been involved in a fatal crash of some form. And here again, you can see that the numbers in a fairly narrow band seems to be trending downward in rural communities from a high of over 60 in 2008. It's now fallen under 40 for the last couple of years. And then the number of school buses involved in a fatal crash in urban communities, again, between 30 and generally 50 each calendar year. And so what that tells us, and I think maybe the main takeaway from that data analysis is that although it is when you factor in the fact that we have over 57 million students that are traveling to school each day, the number of crashes, the number of fatalities, one could postulate is not significantly high. However, it is still a non-zero value. And so there is an importance element here to continue to examine school transportation and to see, how can we improve the overall environment? How can we further improve the overall environment for students so that school trip each day is essentially as safe as possible? And so this study took a look at it from a more qualitative standpoint. We conducted a literature review to see what other studies had been done. We formulated a series of questions, and I'm going to walk through those questions with you here in just a moment. We interviewed 30 subject matter experts, and I'll also highlight who those individuals were in just a sec. And then we analyzed the responses that they provide as part of our interviews. And so the survey questions, there were 9 in total, and let's walk through these real quickly. In your opinion, how has school travel evolved in the last 20 years? Do you think it is safer for kids to travel to and from school than it was 20 years ago? If so, why? If not, why not? In your opinion, what would be the greatest danger or concern associated with school transportation today? In your opinion, how has the role of parents affected school transportation behavior in the last 2 decades? Please share any notable school transportation safety programs or outreach activities that have occurred in the last 20 years. Have we made any progress regarding better school transportation safety data collection? Are there any transportation challenges that school children in rural communities uniquely face? Walking and bicycling to school numbers remain low compared with results from a generation or 2 ago, though data suggests that recent efforts are making a positive impact. Where should communities be focusing their attention to spur more walking and bicycling behavior? And then lastly, what school transportation safety efforts should we be focusing on as we look ahead to the next 20 years? So those were the questions that we targeted as part of this study. And as I mentioned before, we ended up interviewing 30 individuals. Now, the title of this presentation is, expert participants, expert feedback from a school transportation standpoint. And we really narrowed our pool. So, there are a number of different ways we could collect this data. Certainly, we could have, come up with a written form of a survey and then broadly dispersed it to the school transportation community. What we wanted to do for this particular study was a deeper dive. And so we chose to collect our data via interviews. And the individuals that we ended up selecting for this particular study are shown on the screen here. So we actually were able to identify a number of people that participated in and that helped author that Transportation Research Board Special Report 269. So they were involved in that study. Naturally, we felt that they would be important, they would be helpful in gathering some input and opinions for this study. We also interviewed current members of the Transportation Research Board's School Transportation Subcommittee. So this is a subcommittee that I previously chaired. It's the only subcommittee or committee at TRB that focuses exclusively on school transportation. And so we always have a captive audience related to this particular topic. We certainly, the third item, we were able to find some individuals that the research team knew of that have been actively involved in school transportation. So they were part of the interview pool. And then lastly, not surprisingly, when we're interviewing the first three categories, there usually will be someone that says, you know what, I think so-and-so would be able to offer some additional input or would have some helpful commentary on this topic. And so, part of the 30 involved a snowball sample where we pulled some additional people in and interviewed them as well. So who are these people? Well, we didn't want to call them out by name, but we did identify them sort of in terms of their title. And so these are how they were dispersed. And so we had, and generally you see 5 different categories. They each represented about a fifth or about 5 or 6 people. We had individuals that identified themselves as an executive director of an entity or a national director or a CEO. There were also leadership individuals that had a title of president or vice president. We had public agency individuals who identified themselves as a state director or regional or associate director. We had individuals that were working for a public agency or a consultant, and so they identified themselves as an engineer, planner, or policy analyst. And then we also had some people that sort of didn't fit those other 4 buckets, identifying themselves as program managers or sales managers or a coordinator of some sort. So that was one way of kind of capturing the pool of interviewees that we had. We also could kind of slice them into another dimension, if you will. And so here, almost over a quarter of our interviewees identified themselves as working for or associated with some type of a Safe Routes to School program. So the Safe Routes to School, abbreviated SRTS. We had a fifth of our interviewees, or 6 of them, identifying with one of the national school bus associations. So for example, NASDPS, the first acronym, NASDPTS, National Association of State Directors of Pupil Transportation Services. A number of those folks were interviewed for this study. We had another subset of interviewees who worked for some sort of a school bus service. A fifth of our interviewees working for a public transportation department of some sort. And then again, almost a fifth of the remaining pool working as a consultant for a consulting firm or in some form of engineering. So a very broad range of interviewees were addressed as part of this particular study. And so the interview format, we worked with them to find a time. All of the interviews were conducted and then recorded using Zoom. And then once the interview was completed, the transcription from Zoom was taken and then manually checked and edited. So we took the transcripts and then ultimately had to make sure that words were correctly identified, that everything was cleaned up. So although Zoom does a pretty good job of providing a transcript for a particular interview or webinar, there was a little bit of editing that we had to do on the back end. So misspellings, grammar, punctuations were cleaned up by the research team. Ultimately, based on the 30 interviews that were conducted, we collected almost 12 hours of interviews. And so it was I'll be very blunt, it was a somewhat tedious process of actually going through all of the transcripts and cleaning them up. And then once the transcripts were edited, we used a software application called Deduce to process them. And for those of you that are not familiar with Deduce, it's a web application. And since we're dealing with qualitative data as our analysis point, Deduce actually takes that qualitative data and then manages and analyzes it. So we provide Deduce with a framework of what we want to analyze, and then Deduce goes through the process of identifying popular or common themes that come up time and time again based on the feedback that was provided by the interviewees. And so this is a table that at a somewhat high level captures the general themes that came up time and time again from the interviews. And so what you see here is along the top row, if you will, are the themes that were identified. So from left to right, of course, we've got education programs, concerns of the roadway environment, school bus technology as the top three themes. And then the bottom 6 rows show, of course, the different categories of the people that we interviewed. So for example, let me maybe use a one example. Let's choose that numerical value in the upper left. So what we're implying here is that the theme of education programs was mentioned 8 times by folks that were identified with the consulting and engineering group. And so you can see based on this, and you can kind of trace through it, where certain groups emphasized particular themes. And so for presenting in this webinar, what I'm going to do is sort of walk through from left to right the themes that were most popular. So I'll start with the discussion of education programs, followed by concerns of the roadway environment, and then move from left to right. And so the remainder of this webinar, you're going to see, and I apologize, it's maybe a little bit easier sitting in front of your desktop computer, is there's going to be quite a bit of text. These next series of slides are all going to show quotes. So these are direct quotes from our interviewees. And so if there is some text that is not part of the quote, that's going to be some personal conjecture on my part. So as an example, as I mentioned before, one of the most common themes from this analysis was a focus on education programs. And so we had one individual here say, in a lot of communities where there's no bicycle pedestrian infrastructure, bicycle and pedestrian safety education is not emphasized, whether in school or at home environment or at the home environment, because nobody's walking or biking on roadways. So the teaching is not felt, is not needed. And so we tried to get into rural communities as well, even though they say, oh, nobody's going to walk or bike here. Everybody's a pedestrian at some point, even if it just means they're crossing the parking lot of their local grocery store. So that education piece is key. So end quote. And so what we have here is a situation where, as we went through the interview questions and then interviewed the 30 individuals, the general theme of education came up time and time again. So to summarize, you've got this person here feeling like, all right, there needs to be more that could be done from an educational standpoint, particularly in rural communities where walking and biking, not surprisingly, may not be a very common practice. Here's another quote. Kids should still be looking at incoming traffic and making sure that it's safe for them to proceed up and get on the bus. And that goes the same for when they're getting off the bus. They should be taught to look both ways before they step out onto the pavement. Crossing, they should also look both ways. There's a lot of little things like that which could make transportation a lot safer. Essentially implying that when it comes to public education, we still, even though times have changed and technology has become more prevalent, still reminding our young kids, before you cross the street, make sure you're looking both ways. I think these days we could probably add, make sure you're not looking at a handheld device, when you're walking, still paying attention. We also had a number of people that represented the yellow school bus community. And for them, a particular concern is after the child has exited the school bus, they may be crossing in front of the bus, crossing a street. They need to pay particular attention to making sure that all drivers that are traveling adjacent to that yellow school bus are also paying attention. Here's another quote under education programs. I think that teaching kids how to ride a bicycle has become less in the past 20 years. The number of kids that knew how to ride a bike when I first got into this work, and say a 4th grade class, there might be like one kid in the class who didn't know how to ride a bike and everyone else did. Over that time, out of a 4th grade class, maybe there's 6 or 7 that don't know how to ride a bike. And if you don't know how to ride a bike by the time you're in the 4th grade, you're probably never going to learn. So, agree or disagree, this individual is sensing that bicycle transportation, the ability to ride a bike, has declined over time. And certainly there can be a number of external factors that have caused this issue to be present. One more from education programs. The measurement that I use for safe walking is if you wouldn't put your grandma or grandpa or somebody out there and tell them to do it, it's probably not safe to begin with. The idea of making it safe, whether that's funding it to make it safe, whether that's the public education to make it safe, we know how to make biking and walking a safe form of transportation. It's making the commitment to make it a safe form of transportation. We have a ton of great research from planners and engineers and social scientists and public health and all of these great fields. We know how to do it. We just need to do it. And so I think that's another key point here is, there are education programs that are out there. A lot of times it's an implementation challenge, whether it's either cost or time, but we need to continue to make this a general practice. Shifting gears slightly to the theme of roadway environment, here's the quote that one of the interviewees had. In some places, safety will go up as infrastructure is being built. I feel like there is a slow burn movement to complete safe infrastructure near schools so that kids have the options to walk and bike to school, like key crossings, sidewalk infill, things like that. But I also think that in areas where there is not safe infrastructure and there hasn't been a lot of support or resources to community in a long time, they're way behind some of the other communities. They never got that infrastructure to begin with. Here, I can add, if we look at the environment that exists between urban environments and rural, there oftentimes is a pretty significant disparity. And it's, as you might expect, in rural communities where the foot traffic maybe isn't as high, the need for a paved shoulder or a sidewalk has never been, it's never been a priority. Whereas in urban communities, we sort of naturally expect sidewalk, curb gutter, and sidewalk to be present on almost every street. Here's another quote. Another way that we can improve is just generally improve walking and biking infrastructure, especially around schools. Crossings are probably the most dangerous places for kids, and there are many simple, relatively low-cost things that can be done to improve those crossings, particularly like curb extensions or refuge islands to shorten the crossing distance and give kids a safe place to wait when they're not in the street. A lot of times this is easier said than done. There's a cost, of course, associated with any type of public infrastructure. When you install curb extensions, while that can reduce the crossing distance, sometimes that can affect drainage patterns. It might also affect the travel way that you've provided to bicyclists. And so there are a lot of different trade-offs that do occur, but this type of discussion is usually beneficial for any community or for any school. Roadway environment, here's another quote. There's a lack of sidewalks and sort of busy streets in a lot of our rural areas. So as far as encouraging kids to walk and bike to school, that can also be a challenge. I think the condition of the roadways tends to be a little bit more challenging to maintain as well in rural areas. It's the distance, the lack of good infrastructure, and lack of transit service that can be challenges that are unique to rural areas. In terms of school bus technology, as I mentioned, we had a number of folks representing our yellow school bus community. Here's a quote. There's been tremendous gains in safety and technology. In general, I would say our industry is well behind the curve, but we are getting there. Over the last 20 years, there has been a tremendous amount of difference and improvement in that area, specifically the use of video cameras on vehicles, the use of GPS or ABL vehicle location systems, computerized routing and data that has been of students have all improved greatly in that time. So the use of technology is a theme that came up time and time again. And certainly there have been some incremental improvements that have been made, but the general consensus is that there's, how you use that technology, how do you make it beneficial, how do you translate that into improving safety for students, that remains a work in progress. Here's another quote. I think that in the last 20 years, we've benefited from a lot of technology, such as LED lighting, improvements with the stop arms. I think that there's been some design changes, especially with technology related, We can control the speeds of vehicles along with the braking. So there's a lot of technology available on the buses should a state or a school district specify it that way. Here, if I can digress real quickly, the technology that has been implemented with school bus stop arm technology continues to evolve. You're seeing much more visible displays. That being said, the number of people that continue to violate school buses, particularly when they're displaying the stop sign, continues to be quite significant. I work with the NASDIP's National Association of State Directors of People Transportation Services, and each year they actually conduct a study where they will ask their school bus drivers to log the number of people that illegally pass their school bus when the stop sign is displayed. And so usually when that stop sign is displayed, there's also flashing lights, there's other safety measures that are in play. And the number of violations that are captured by the drivers, by the drivers who are reporting this data is in the tens of thousands. And so if you translate that, so that it's in the tens of thousands on any given school day. And of course, if you translate that over a 180-day school year, it is a staggeringly high number. And so even though we have had improvements in school bus visibility, there's still a lot more that can be done, particularly on the driver education front. Here's another quote, going back to school bus technology. Technology is on the cusp of being able to have what is referred to as vehicle-to-vehicle communication, where a school bus could send a message to the vehicle approaching a stop and either notify that driver there's a stop school bus ahead with a visual and an audible signal, or eventually maybe even take control of that vehicle and stop, like adaptive cruise control does today. So potentially that may be the solution that is where we end up, is where the technology, the vehicle-to-vehicle technology will be fully implemented, where if there is a stopped school bus, any vehicle that is traveling either behind the bus or in the opposing lane will naturally come to a stop based on the technology that's in that vehicle. Another theme that is important to mention, so the previous slides kind of covered the top three themes, and what I wanted to do was kind of quickly go over some of the other comments that came up from some of these other themes. Because when it comes to school transportation, I think what we recognize is it's not a singular item that is important. It's a very comprehensive, it's a very, very comprehensive puzzle that we need to examine and recognize there are many different roles, that there are many different players that must be contributing in order for school transportation to be possible for everybody. And so the role of parents is critical. Here are a couple quotes. Parents ultimately are the decision makers in how children get to and from school. Sometimes children can influence their parents on the decision, but usually it's the parents who decide whether to put them on a bus or let them walk or bike, or to put them in a vehicle. I think parents are concerned about safety, and there's the perception that driving their children makes it safer. And then here's the last one. I would say that my experience, there's less of an acceptance of responsibility for student behavior by parents. In terms of better data collection, this is a topic that I kind of talked about already. We've got a couple of some feedback here. That was a major issue in our work. This again referring to Special Report 269 almost 20 years ago. The national database for school transportation is weak at best. There's not been much progress, even though we made those recommendations 20 years ago. It hasn't advanced much at all, was the opinion of this one person. Second person said, I'll say certain states have gotten much better and do a very good job of tracking that data. I can also say that it's still a challenge nationally because, and I'll add the word individual, states track data, and they all track data differently for various reasons. Sometimes just because their state specific legislation is different than other states And just what they characterize makes it difficult to combine into a national database. Some states have improved it greatly, and on a national basis, we just don't have it right yet. And you'll notice some of these quotes, there's a little bit of syntax that maybe that isn't quite perfect. And again, we took these, these quotes are direct from the transcript to the best of our abilities. So I didn't sanitize them 100%. So that's why some of these sentences may not read perfectly. Poor driver behavior. We had this individual say, focusing on the passing motorist. So that specifically means the motorist does not stop, does not obey the red stoplights, and comes through while the bus is stopped, either loading or unloading students. The number one cause of fatalities throughout the country of students is passing motorists. Another person stated, people just don't pay attention. It's changed. People used to be a lot more conscientious with how they drove. Now they're not. Their heads are on their phone. They're texting. They're talking on the phone. That's a child being hit by a passing. That's a child being hit by a passing motorist is probably the most likely safety issue. In terms of community planning, we continue to build schools on the edges of communities in places that don't have good infrastructure for walking and biking, and where students need to travel a fair distance in order to access that school. By comparison, schools consolidating and serving really large regions, there's just so many barriers, physical, social, to getting to school safely outside of the vehicle especially. If I can pause here and make a comment, this is an issue that I think is in a lot of ways at the root of why walking and biking has declined over time. And it focuses on the site planning of schools, and in particularly new schools that come on board. Not surprisingly, over time, land prices have increased. The ability of a school district to build a neighborhood school in a well-established neighborhood, I think that's sort of gone by the wayside unless it's part of sort of a master plan community. But what you find, and it's certainly true in where I'm at here in Moscow, Idaho, is these communities, these residential communities will come on board. And then of course, as the number of school children grows, the local school district will then need to build, for example, a new elementary school. And of course, the only place where there will be available land to build that new elementary school usually is going to be on the outskirts of the community, where either the land is cheaper or where there is a parcel that is large enough to accommodate a school and the playground and the parking facilities that go along with that new facility. And so invariably, you have a new school that is built on the outskirts of a community or a neighborhood, and it's not always going to have the infrastructure that allows for a lot of those students to either walk or bike. These schools, most oftentimes, especially in smaller communities, are going to be built along a busy arterial, or if it's in a rural community, along a rural highway. So now you're dealing with higher speeds, higher volumes. And so naturally, parents are going to be a little bit more apprehensive about allowing their son or daughter to walk, especially if they're elementary school age. And so what you have is this kind of a spiral where, because the new school is located where it's not easy to travel using a non-motorized mode, is you're going to have more students that are going to either have to take a yellow school bus or get a ride from mom and dad. And so that in essence causes those walking and bicycling rates to go down. The other element that kind of gets thrown in here, and it's based on what I saw when I worked for the county, is that these schools, of course, when they're designing them, when the planners and engineers are designing the layout of the schools, is they want to make sure that they're creating an egress and ingress that is as beneficial, as positive as possible. And so a lot of times they come up with these wonderful designs where they'll have the parking and the parent drop off in one area of the school, and then they'll separate or segregate the yellow school bus pickup and drop off, so that it's not conflicting or interfering with all of the passenger cars and parents that are present. And so now you've got really good infrastructure for both the parents to come in and pick up their child, and you've got really good infrastructure for the yellow school buses. And so naturally, now again, you're creating an environment which is really easy if you're utilizing one of the motorized modes. And so all of that, I think, comes into play with regard to why we're seeing walking and biking not as popular as it was a generation or two ago. All right, along community planning, let's go back to another quote here. We're also up against school consolidation, which has been one of the biggest factors in the last 5 to 7 years with budget changes in school systems and so forth. So literally the opportunity has changed for students because they don't live within that proximity to school. And then you also have programs such as magnet schools and kids moving around to schools which are nowhere near their home. We've really moved away from a community school environment where walking and biking was more readily accessible. With regard to distance and time spent on school buses, a couple of points came up. Yeah, I think in the rural communities, the biggest concern is that the long distances they have. Many of them have to be bused to school just because of distances and the lack of sidewalks in rural areas. Similar comment. I mean, the obvious, the distance. You know, school consolidation in rural communities has been so vast over the last 5 to 7 years where there used to be somewhat of a community orientation to schools. They weren't so spread out, and the consolidation has happened so much that kids have 45-minute, hour-long bus rides. And that is the only alternative because there's not a walking or biking option. And then along those lines, one of the big challenges for the rural communities is the best use of this being the students' time. They're spending a lot of time on the bus and they've got a long way to go. They're trying to find ways to use their time efficiently. Some companies have been very successful in coming into those environments and adding Wi-Fi to buses and making it more of a moving school type environment where kids can do their homework. A couple other insights here. I think the biggest problem that I've seen so far across the board, and this isn't just rural, but it certainly affects rural communities as well, is driver availability. It's becoming more difficult with the number of requirements on a professional school bus driver. It's more difficult to recruit for, and it's one of those things that I think makes it difficult for folks to get the transportation. There's a mandate for that transportation to happen, but the ease at which a transportation operation can recruit folks and retain employees may not match the need and how many folks are able to be transported with the staffing they have. And certainly school bus drivers, the availability of school bus drivers was particularly problematic during the recent pandemic. Another insight, I think in other ways it's less safe. I think our roadways have gotten bigger and faster. Vehicles have gotten a lot bigger. There's a lot of evidence emerging SUVs and pickups are much more dangerous for children if they are struck by those vehicles because they're more likely to get knocked down and run over than a smaller vehicle. The mass of those vehicles is so big that if they do get hit by those vehicles, they are much more likely to be injured seriously or killed. And then tangentially, if I may, I think it'll be interesting from a safety perspective to see the potential impacts associated with electric vehicles that are becoming much more popular. And particularly because these electric vehicles are much quieter than your gasoline engines. And so, you know, students will really need to be much more attentive if they happen to walk and bike in an environment where there are also a lot of electric vehicles present. Here's another insight that is always, it's one that we always need to factor in. I think it's safer in one case, and that case is that I think the fear of stranger danger is much overblown. In very few cases around the country when children are endangered by others around the school, it's not a stranger quite often, it's a non-custodial parent, for instance, and yet those stories drive other parents to determine that it is not safe for their children. And the data generally indicates that this is the case. Certainly when there is an abduction of some sort, it hits the news very, very quickly. But in fact, the number of abductions by complete strangers is very, very low. As this quote indicates, a lot of times it's not a stranger per se, it's an abduction by somebody that the child actually knows. A non-custodial parent, it may be a relative of some sort as well. So lessons learned, I've done a lot of talking, kind of want to put a bow on this particular presentation. A lot of different factors, and it was hard to kind of boil them down to a couple coherent ones, but here are 5 total based on the remarks and feedback provided by our interviewees. Certainly the need for better data collection is still relevant to further walking and bicycling behaviors and to identify overall trends. It's hard to sort of compare apples to apples when we've got different methods that are in play between communities and states. So the standardization of data collection is desired, but we note it is still difficult to organize. The fact that we've got parents driving children to school will continue to affect safety. This is, I think, an issue that is not going to go away. The congestion that exists during our morning and afternoons will continue to be present, and I think as communities, we need to find good ways to manage that. And I think it is a collective activity between the students, the parents, the schools, local law enforcement, to make sure that amidst all of the chaos that exists, that everyone is able to get home safely. And then school children, parents, transportation operators, teachers, administrators must continue to be vigilant, recognizing that the reality, and this was a comment that I made earlier, the reality is that the lack of land availability and the high cost will continue to push school districts and schools to be located further away from existing neighborhoods. Roadway environment factors will always be a concern for most transportation modes. The need for walking and bicycling infrastructure, if we want to continue to promote that, recognizing that we're going to have other sort of inventive outside the box safety infrastructure that's present, be it narrow roads, complete streets, landscaping, green strips, bulb outs, to promote active modes of travel. And certainly want to mention the yellow school bus and vehicle technology will continue to evolve and improve over time. And certainly the beneficial use of camera technology, vehicle-to-vehicle communication can help us to identify potential dangers that are in that environment, and can potentially also help to specifically pinpoint certain walking and bicycling crashes. And so with that, my second to last slide is the recognition that when it comes to managing school transportation and promoting a safe school transportation environment, it is a complex activity. It involves a lot of people, and only if we sort of work together, and this gets to my third bullet item, only if when we share responsibility can we find an outcome that is beneficial. As you'll recall, earlier in the presentation, I shared with you a couple slides about the number of school transportation fatalities, number of buses that are involved in fatalities. I think our end goal is it's the same for everyone. We'd like to see those numbers reach zero and stay at zero for the indefinite future. And there's still a little bit of work to do. Some of the technology that is evolving, I think, will help us to assess the crashes and fatalities that exist, and also assist in the data collection efforts that are very much needed. And so with that, that concludes this webinar. I'm certainly available to answer any questions if there are any questions that are out there. I'm also available via email at kchang, KCHANG at uidaho.edu. So with that, I appreciate your attention and participation today. And I'll turn it back over to CSET for any concluding remarks. Thank you very much.
All right. Are there any questions? If any of the audience have questions, if you could raise your hand so you could speak. All right. I guess if there's no questions, thank you for coming. And the recording will be posted on the CSET YouTube channel, where the webinar that Kevin mentioned earlier is already posted. And thank you again.